Hi, I'm Wright, and I'm excited to join you this morning for the 2020 AMA Virtual Conference. Welcome to day 2, where yesterday you heard from scholar Jonah Berger about how to change minds. Well, this morning we're going to continue the theme of how to change minds and win hearts. I'm from New York City, where I'm a scholar practitioner, teaching communication to graduate students at Columbia University while serving as a partner at global marketing and communication agency Ogilvy. Between the two jobs, I help leaders build better brands. And over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to challenge your perspective on communication. What you thought you knew, how you have been navigating it, and the role that communication plays in helping your business grow. As we enter a new year of 2020 and a new decade of perpetual beta, we are all on the hunt for new ideas and new growth strategies. The world has changed significantly from even 10 years ago, so adopting new strategies will determine whether your organization survives for the next 10 years or not. Specifically, we are going to unpack 3 subjects that I've studied during the past 10 years: communication, branding, and consumer behavior, to help you cut through an increasingly noisy world. Ultimately, we're going to talk about how to make brands matter. To make brands matter today, it's not about share of voice alone. And you might be shocked if I told you that making brands matter today isn't always about having the better product, higher awareness, or the most impressions. Based on research of 1,500 fast-growing companies, I will tell you which parts of a brand matter most. My hope by the end of this session is that you can identify one principle that is incredibly sticky, and you'll use that principle as a wedge to foster a new dialogue and commitment internally to adopt one strategy across the organization. And what we're about to talk about is simple enough to be adopted in marketing, communication, sales, and beyond. Today, we're going to cover 4 areas, doing a little brand math. First, we're going to cover the difference between a company and a brand and discuss how they are additive to each other. Second, we will explore the relationship between culture and communities and the power of starting to shift language like target audience to more inspirational language like community. Third, we'll discuss the role of feelings in our everyday decision making and perceptions of brands and test the bounds of our rational thought. And last, we will end with a 5-part brand health checkup, which you can use to evaluate your brand health or determine where to invest resources. So, let's get to work. Let's jump into the first area of a company and a brand. I often ask individuals, what's the relationship between a company or a brand? And inquisitively, most people reply, well, isn't the brand your company's reputation? No, they are discretely different, yet additive. So let me explain why understanding the difference will matter to your organization's survival. When you think of how to measure the performance of a company, leaders often rely on revenue, but they also go to another metric, Net Promoter Score, or NPS, developed in 2003 by a director at Bain & Consulting. Today, over 200 of the Fortune 500 companies use NPS as a guide for customer experience. It has become one metric beloved by boards of directors, C-suite members, and consultants. But NPS is not the only number companies throw into their data models or dashboards. Today, there's more data than ever, and the volume of data will continue to get louder and louder. Consider one touch point, the mobile phone. In an average day, a millennial interacts with their mobile phone over 150 times a day. Let me put that in another context. The average American scrolls through over 300 feet of content daily on their mobile devices alone. That's the height of the Statue of Liberty. Now imagine walking up the Statue of Liberty with your thumb every day. That's the volume of noise that's around us. Today, there's more data than ever, and that volume of data will continue to increase. So I have to be honest. With all the new technology platforms and channels that produce tons of data, it's harder and harder to actually tell if the marketing and communication you're transmitting is effective because consumers are so distracted. Yet that doesn't seem to stop the data obsession of marketers and leaders. But which approach is better? Simplifying all metrics down to one, like Net Promoter Score, or capturing hundreds of metrics for each consumer interaction? In my academic and professional opinion, both are flawed. Data indecision leads to digital dashboards. And while we think those dashboards make our organizations appear more sophisticated, it's actually requiring individuals to be something they're not, data scientists. It might not surprise you to know that, according to Forrester, the average Fortune 100 company has 15 to 17 different data providers. What will shock you is how much of that data is actually used. Less than 15%. Yes, that's right. The average Fortune 100 company wastes 85% of the data it has coming in. So, is the dog chasing the tail or vice versa? So why do we drive ourselves crazy with our data obsessions? Likely because it gives us this false sense of security that the more data we have coming in, the better our company must be performing, or the better we can optimize or calibrate our company against other organizations. But there's another rude reality we must confront about people who obsess about data. They're no better off at getting a company to succeed than the next person. Net, all of that data is failing you. How do I know? Well, 50% of Fortune 500 companies fail. Actually, let me be a bit more precise. According to consultancy Capgemini, who cataloged every company ever listed on Fortune 500 list between 2000 and 2015, 52% of companies, to be exact, have gone extinct, merged, or disappeared. Worse than measuring too much data is not measuring the right data. Cultural ethnographer Tricia Wang coined the term quantification bias to explain what happens in our data obsession. She explains that just because you can't measure something doesn't mean it's unimportant. And just because you can measure something also doesn't make that thing you're measuring important. So we need to ask ourselves, why are we measuring what we do? And what does all that data tell us about performance in a way that can lead to growth? So I want to offer you a new perspective about the relationship between company and brand. Company is about operational efficiency, and brand is about value creation. And organizations that don't reconcile their understanding of what a company is and what a brand is end up in a declining market position. Misalignment leads to failure. Often boards and C-suite officers focus on establishing a 30,000-foot view of the organization, such as through one metric like NPS, while marketers and sales professionals on the ground focus on hundreds of engagement metrics. There must be a meeting in the middle. Everyone in the organization must align on the same objective. When you chase operational efficiency, your marketing and communication is considered optimized based on reach and repetition. When you pursue value creation, your marketing and communication is considered optimized based on if it resonates and is relevant. So, in the pursuit of making brands matter, which one do you think is most important? Hopefully, like me, your perspective is starting to shift towards resonance and relevancy. Researchers are starting to put a value on all that value creation and finding that customers are 2 times more valuable to an organization when there's an emotional connection between a brand and consumer. Emotionally connected consumers then have a 2x lift in terms of sales and lifetime value. So if you're in the business of value creation and striving for resonance and relevancy, then we must recognize that there is a new third rail in the brand consumer relationship. And that third rail is community. And unlike 10 years ago, when many of us in this session might have learned marketing, the role of community was not at the forefront of our processes or decision making. Instead, we focused on demographics within a target audience. As we will later discuss under the brand health checkup, the fastest growing companies of the past decade benefited from their cult followings and devotees. And that trend of communities around brands being a source of growth will continue well into the next decade. The one thing to remember about culture is that it comes directly from communities. So if you're trying to influence culture, then you must recognize communities that people belong to. To lean into the concept of community, I want to give you 2 tips. First, shift your thinking from, quote, target audience, which is about the brand consumer relationship, to community, which recognizes the third rail to turbocharge a brand. People are always scanning for signals around them. So you have to figure out how you can become one of those positive signals that individuals focus on. In order to understand those signals, we also must recognize that individuals don't exist within isolation. And that's what the idea of target audience often posits, that we have a one-to-one relationship with a person, but it doesn't pay attention to the fact that people have duplicative relationships with others through communities. Each community transmits and creates a unique set of communications and artifacts: music, fashion, art, food, traditions, and language. So the second tip is that we have to recognize that people are driven by their sense of belonging. And as social media increases, people will have an increased desire to show what parts of community that they belong. So it's far more efficient to address the community than a single member of a target audience. When we think about communication at its core, we have to think about receptivity. And this is why resonance matters. We have messages that are encoded, and then they are transmitted through a number of different mediums. And when they go through those mediums, as we talked about, they encounter the headwinds of noise. You're competing against all the hundreds of other things that appear in the news feed of someone as they scroll or as they interact with different devices or navigate through their life on a regular basis. We tell our students at Columbia that awareness is not an objective. For marketers and communicators, our main goal is behavioral change. And when you set behavioral change as your objective, then every communication, to the best of your ability, needs to have some type of built-in feedback to it. And when we have a system in which there is a message that goes out and there's feedback that comes from it, then it is a closed system that we can start to optimize from a communication standpoint. But we must have the component of feedback. My goal as an educator is to help people easily adopt new thinking. So before I tell you the 5 patterns of fast growing companies, I want to be more specific about what a communication is. We just talked about how a single communication works. But what about communication as a system? Because advertising, marketing, PR, at the end of the day, is all communication. Every communication has several elements, and being strategic requires thinking about how you are activating each element to spark an emotion that can create action. The elements include the words we say or read, the sounds we hear, and the visuals we see. If you were to draw a circle, I want you to think about how those 3 different elements of the words and sounds and visuals break down. You see, the majority of communication is actually in the delivery of different elements of communication. It is the expressions of communication. We often focus so much on the words that we are saying. We pay attention to our tagline, we focus on the mission statement, and we prioritize the talking points that our senior executives may be championing out in the marketplace. But words alone are not enough to spark emotion and incite favorable action. Let me give you some examples of how you can nuance connecting between different emotions and different types of communication. So let's say you wanted to spark the emotion of happiness. You could evoke that through different words. You can deploy different taglines or funny copy lines. And we often do this. We often start our briefs with a bunch of words that go onto a page, and those words are intended to spark creativity. But there's other tools that we have within the communication repertoire. You can use color. Warm and bright colors like orange and yellow evoke happiness. You can use imagery, such as emojis, or the picture of babies. You can use audio. The sound of laughter evokes happiness. Or you can use the combination of words, sounds, and visuals in the form of an experience, such as Snapchat creating a filter last year that allowed individuals to turn themselves into a baby. You see, when we think about the communication spectrum, there are many different ways to communicate the same thing, which all go beyond the traditional use of words that we often hyperfixate on from a communication standpoint. And the brands that grow the fastest are brands that activate and understand that communication spectrum. So let's move to the 3rd principle. And I want to dig into this before we get to the 5 parts of the brand health checkup, because we have to dive a little bit deeper into the way that individuals think and behave so we can apply different forms of communication to the right parts of a journey. Much of marketing and communication today is based on economic principles of 250 years ago. And as marketers, many of us have built strategies to reach consumers based on a few assumptions about people. So let's revisit those assumptions in a very light Econ 101 lesson. We tend to think that people are reasonable and act rationally. We think people always know what they want. We think people can judge the benefit and the value of choices they are given, such as buying one product or service versus another. And we think people always act in their own self-interest, doing what's best for them and their wallet. In 2017, University of Chicago professor Richard Thaler was recognized for his work in decoding what gets people to take action. And in winning the Nobel Prize in Economics, he helped amplify the field of behavioral economics. Before him in 2002, Daniel Kahneman won for his body of research in behavioral economics. Lucky for you, we don't have to wait another 15 years to understand the impact on marketing and communication of behavioral economics, often paired with psychology as behavioral science. What we have come to know is that consumer behavior and thought is changing. We are evolving. All of those connections to the Internet of Things, technology, and the emergence of community and the easy transmittance of messages across different mediums is all rewiring us and having an influence on how we think and behave. And the question for us then becomes, what are we evolving towards? And how does that evolution influence our ability to grow and manage companies and brands? Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow, gave us a central premise. Mental effort, I would argue, is relatively rare. Most of the time, we coast. And that most, according to Daniel Kahneman and Harvard Business School professor Gerald Zaltman, is about 95% of the time. So I'll say that again. 95% of the time, we are operating in autopilot, trying to minimize the amount of thought that we have to put towards decisions. Because on an average day, an adult makes 35,000 decisions. Way too many to apply rational thought to. We are always looking for shortcuts in terms of our decision making. And what we have found is that about 70% of our decisions are influenced not by ration, but by emotions. And so feelings become incredibly important in terms of inciting action. Antonio Damasio, a professor of neuroscience at the University of Southern California, someone who has studied the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and neuroscientists, has given us a really key principle that we have to pay attention to, which is emotion, feeling, and biological regulation all play a role in human reason. We are not thinking machines. We are feeling machines that think. And it's that provocation that we are feeling machines first and foremost that makes us consider, as marketers and communicators, how do we lean more into feelings so that our communications can have resonance and relevancy. So the question that I'll often get is, well, there's only like 6 emotions that people can feel. So how much dexterity is there in a strategy that's rooted in emotions and feelings? There are actually about 34,000 emotions that have been cataloged over the past few decades. However, many of those emotions are ineffable. They simply don't translate between one language and another. But I want to make one thing a little bit clear. When you think of emotions and feelings, there are differences between the two. An emotion is a short-term state. Consider that like a bee sting, something that lasts for a few minutes. A feeling happens and is formed over a longer, prolonged period. That period could be days, could be months, it could be years. But regardless of whether it's emotion or feeling, we are taught to express ourselves using the language of feelings ever since childhood. And so it is a communication style that is universal and we all can relate to. We tend to think of feelings from a prism of 6 to 8 core emotions: happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, fear, surprise. And having visited the Consumer Electronics Show last week, I must admit that even technology is getting good at decoding these emotions. With new technology, we actually can determine up to 108 emotions. In the next decade, expect technologies like facial recognition to become a mainstay in research methodologies for creative and copy testing. Emotions are deeply complex things. Since the 1970s, researchers have cataloged emotions along 3 different dimensions. And based on the action that we're trying to incite, there are different reasons why we may deploy different emotions based on how pleasurable that emotion is, based on how aroused that emotion makes us, or based on how dominant an emotion can become in a given situation. But just as we don't need everyone in an organization masquerading as a data scientist, let's leave the psychology to the behavioral scientists. But I do want to give you a very simple 5-part system that you can use as a brand health checkup. But let's do a quick review before we jump into it. So far, we discussed 3 important shifts from the past 10 years. First, a company and a brand is not one and the same, but do require deep coordination and commitment for alignment so that the most important information is measured and we do not suffer from data distraction. And that most important information to start measuring is something that we may have considered immeasurable in the past, such as emotions that new technologies are starting to unlock and enable us to decode. Second, to win in the speedway of culture, you have to ignite the 3rd rail of community in the brand consumer relationship. Because that 3rd rail of community is what will turbocharge growth for your organization. And third, as the world around us evolves, we are more ruled by feelings than rational thought. With those 3 new truths for a world of perpetual beta, we can now unpack how to create a value-based brand. Brand, as we've come to define it, is traditionally made of 4 areas: a symbol, such as a mark, fonts, colors that we put into a consistent palette, and shape. But as we all can attest on this webinar, brand means so much more in this digital world than just those 4 areas. I've spent the past 3 years gathering data based on Antonio Damasio's provocation that we are feeling machines that think, to better understand how fast-growing companies are using emotion to cut through the noise to create connections with consumers. Over the 3-year period, I reviewed communications from 1,500 fast-growing companies from Alibaba to Zara. Companies that included digital darlings from SoulCycle to 100-year-old brands like Oreo. My goal with evaluating communications, both online and physical, was to identify patterns. to understand what is going to motivate a consumer or an entire community to take action. In August 2019, I released the research about the top 5 patterns. If you follow me on LinkedIn in the next hour, I'll send 2 people a copy of the book. Today, we're going to cover the 5 shortcuts you can use to ace communication in the next decade. The top 5 patterns of fast-growing companies include 5 areas you need to consider for your marketing strategy in 2020. First, lexicon. The words you use so often that people start to associate those terms with only your brand. Audio. What someone hears that instantly makes them think of your brand. Visuals. How your brand shows up in conversations that consumers aren't necessarily having with you, the organization, but how you show up in conversations that individuals are having with each other in their communities. Experience. The behaviors consumers take using your product or brand that can become tradition or a ritual. And last and fifth, culture. How your company uses internal policies and external practices to reinforce one positive feeling. And what I want to spend the rest of our time doing together is giving you examples of companies that have successfully deployed each of these 5 areas so that you can hopefully find one principle that you can turn into practice. Since childhood, we learn information in chunks, usually 3 or 4 things at a time. Our minds, which consume 20% of our body's energy, will generally do the work of sorting and chunking, but our minds appreciate a little help. So we try to activate new delivery techniques and keywords, and not keywords in the traditional search sense that we may know them online, but keywords in the sense of a speakeasy. So I'll explain that in one moment. We are always trying to find ways that we can group information to ignite different ideas that have been based on our experiences. So for instance, if I say what has 4 legs, stripes, and eats grass, you may consider a zebra. Because generally, you can tell someone a few pieces of choiceful information and they can paint the rest of their picture in the head. Brands that do this really well benefit from a principle called branded vocabulary. And I want to give you 2 examples of how to turn mundane moments in a customer journey into something that is distinguishable and ownable from a lexicon standpoint. So if we go back to that idea of keywords and you consider them the thing that you say if you knock on the door of a speakeasy, the community will understand them and let you in. The first example I want to give you is of the US-based company Southwest Airlines, which is a fast-growing company that has defied most odds in terms of revenue returns of 26 quarters of growth. They use branded vocabulary to create a unique moment around the pre-flight safety instructions that are mandatory for every airline and thus often get tuned out. By allowing flight attendants to tell jokes, the airline elevates a mundane moment into a memorable experience that leaves the customer with a positive feeling with the brand, humor, and the delivery of the same message that every airline has to give. The second example that I want to give you is of a little burger chain on the West Coast known as In-N-Out Burger. By no means are they anywhere near the market leader McDonald's. Yet, they have experienced fast growth over the past decade based on having language that directly sparks positive emotions among their beloved customers. For instance, you don't just go and order a cheeseburger or a hamburger. You ask for something that may be double double or animal style. And just like knocking on the door of that speakeasy, when you can use that language and it's unique to the community of individuals that dine there, then you start to foster emotional connections and you start to amplify this sense of belonging that is core to how individuals navigate the world. Let's look at the second area of audio. Audio has become bigger than ever. While we got rid of vinyls and cassettes a decade ago, we see that they're starting to come back. And now music, for instance, as one part of audio, has double-digit sales growth in both vinyls and cassettes. The music industry is at a 6-year high. When we look at other parts of audio, such as individuals that are using smart speakers, what we know is that technology has crossed the chasm. Voice-controlled speakers are now in over 25% of US households. Amazon alone has sold over 100 million voice-controlled Echoes. If you look at another phenomenon of audio, such as podcasts, it has reached mainstream adoption with nearly 40% of individuals reporting that they have listened to a podcast within the last year. And with Spotify surpassing 100 million accounts, they are now larger than some of the most widely distributed television channels in the United States. So when we think of audio, we're not only talking about music and voice, but we're also talking about different sonic tones that are used. And we can often think of some of the most iconic ones throughout the course of history, whether it's the famous whistle from the Harlem Globetrotters, dough from Homer Simpson, or even from gaming such as Tetris, which happens to be the 3 most known trademark sounds in the world. But I want to offer you another strategy when it comes to audio. Consider the bird box test. If you were to close your eyes and imagine that your customer could only find your brand based on audio alone, would they be able to? Well, in the movie Bird Box, which aired on Netflix and was the most watched movie in the US during a 1-week period with 40 million individuals watching it during the first week of release, that became a reality. And so I want you to think of that context. Could your customers today find your product based on no visuals, only audio? For most companies, you would fail the Bird Box test. Not a single tone would come to mind in terms of a brand association, and that becomes a piece of low-hanging fruit. Now, the next question that I often get is, well, how are we going to compete against some companies that have had audio for decades and are so well known within the category? And the honest reality is, it takes shorter than you think in order for audio to become a memorable part of your brand. AT&T, for instance, has named their sonic logo, which was created in 2014, as the #1 brand asset that they have, even ahead of their logo mark. Within 5 years, a new audio strategy and a new sonic logo became the #1 brand asset. It was 1994 when Intel introduced their famous chimes. It was the same year that Whitney Houston won the Grammy Record of the Year for I Will Always Love You. And in the decade that came after it, those chimes could be heard somewhere in the world in one channel or another every 3 seconds. The reason why these companies have won when it comes to audio recognition and sonic branding is because they play into the 3 things that audio does best. As a shortcut to developing an audio strategy, those companies are giving lessons to the 3 things that you should consider for your own organization. How you can use audio to create mood, such as what audio might be playing in stores, how you can use audio to spread messages, such as what voice is representing your brand or giving instructions to your customers. And lastly, how audio can help spur behavior. And that audio does not have to contain words. It does not have to contain music. It can simply be a tone. According to researchers at MIT, we process images at 13 milliseconds. A millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. How fast is that? Well, the average person blinks every 4 seconds. So imagine how much information we can process visually within a blink. And with so many changes from a digital standpoint, defaulting towards visual searches, whether using Google Lens or using Pinterest, we are starting to become a visual society. Each year, fewer than 1,000 new words are added to top dictionaries like Merriam-Webster or Oxford. According to internet expert and venture capitalist Mary Meeker, 35,000 new images are posted to social media every second. Over 3 billion new images daily. Communication is shifting towards being visual and audio-based rather than text-based. Language is ever evolving, and its evolution has prompted individuals to start looking at what parts of visuals actually contain the most information that individuals are most attracted to. And so I conducted a piece of research, and I'll share some of the results with you. In that research, we wanted to know how the pace of change within certain dictionaries, and arguably dictionaries are the codes of communities, but how those dictionaries were changing over time. And what we found is that we are returning to a glyph society of emojis and GIFs. And once upon a time, when there were only 5,000 to 7,000 different hieroglyphics that existed, we thought that that communication style was very elementary. Yet we are returning to this style because we see this richness and dexterity of the level of emotion that can be compressed. And what we find is that the fastest growing part of communication that's used from a visual standpoint is often GIFs. Yet, they did not appear until the mid-2010s. And so emojis and GIFs, for instance, didn't become part of the Twitter sphere until 2014. Emoji was the Oxford Word of the Year in 2015. So within 5 years, just like we saw with AT&T and audio, visuals and a new visual language has started to emerge. And 20% of social media posts contain either emoji or GIF. And in fact, in terms of GIFs, in 2018, the founder of Giphy, Alex Chung, announced at South by Southwest during a keynote that they were doing 1/10 of the search volume of Google. Again, 1 in 10 searches are for GIFs. And so if you have a brand that's been around for 10 years and you haven't updated your brand guidelines in that period, then chances are you are missing major parts of communication. And to give you an example, of how important it is to adopt these new types of communication, consider the fast growing company or league, the NBA. The NBA, as of 10 years ago, was 1/5 the size of the NFL. Over the past couple of years, the NBA has grown in revenue by over 20% each year. And now the NBA is about 80% of the size of the NFL. One of the strategies that they used to achieve such high growth was focusing on the part of communication that individuals have with each other in a community, which is the instant replay. And by investing in technology so that they can convert instant replays into GIFs instantaneously, they have experienced a surge in terms of social conversation. So while the NBA may be smaller than the NFL in size, they actually benefit from twice as much social conversation. By 2015, research from Forrester reported that 6% of S&P 500 index companies had a C-suite member in charge of customer experience. And so when we look at this next area of growth, we have to consider experience at large. In spring 2018, Gartner conducted a double-blind research among 6,700 consumers in 15 countries. Their research revealed that 80% of consumers felt that the experience of a company was the most important brand touchpoint. And when IBM Institute for Business Value partnered with Oxford Economics in 2018, they sought to ask 2,000 CMOs an important question, which is, what is the most important business threat? And that number one business threat that 85% of them cited was experience. And so when we think about experience, we can think about it from two perspectives. First, experience is the combination or expression of lexicon, audio, and visuals all coming together. And second, experience is all about creating a normative behavior. And it is through that normative behavior that we will start to close the communication feedback loop. So our job then as marketers and communicators is to put forth an expression of the brand that creates an experience that ideally becomes normative. And what I mean by normative is that it's something that becomes a ritual. So that individuals that are community members starts to use that same pattern of behavior time and time again. So for instance, if you're a beauty brand, it's not just part of the tapestry of the brand for you to use it at home, but for you to take pictures and to post it so that you are badging and showing that you are part of this larger community. And that doesn't require millions of dollars from an activation standpoint. Creating normative behavior can be some of the most beautifully simple, creative, or guerrilla executions, as in this example of Nike. If you are all about the recreational athlete or the professional athlete that's training as a weekend warrior, then you need to intercept them, not through words, but through their normal behaviors, such as jogging on trails. And so it's more about finding the proper places that you can start to introduce disruptions rather than high frequency of reach and repetition. The last area that we'll cover is culture. Managing over $6 trillion in assets, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink joined the company in 1988 and has since grown it to be bigger than Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, Thomas Jefferson's BNY Mellon, and JP Morgan Chase's banking empire. In his 2018 letter, Fink recognized to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. And it's no longer enough for companies to rest on maximizing shareholder profit alone. It is part of every member of a company's organization to do their part in pushing forward the company's purpose. But as we enter this speedway of culture, one of the things we have to recognize is a sense of brand safety. And so early last year, I had a chance to participate in a LinkedIn course called Marketing to Diverse Audiences. And let's be honest, when we talk about communities, most communities, at least in the US in the future and in the next decade, is going to be a diverse audience. And aside from traditional things of immersing with those communities to understand their behaviors, thoughts, and beliefs and habits, and how they produce the artifacts of fashion, culture, art, and music that they do, we can think of three things to help keep brands safe in terms of a culture ethics test. We need empathy and to express a level of respect for audiences and individuals that lead communities. We need to empower those communities and ask ourselves, how does our brand make a community better off that we're trying to target? And then last, we need to express a level of earnestness, committing to the causes and organizations and issues that matter most to those communities that we profit from. So again, the 5 patterns of fast-growing companies include using keywords to trigger a feeling among a tribe, creating audio for instant recognition, giving consumers visuals that help them communicate with each other in their community, creating normative behaviors so people show the role of your product or service within a community, and ensuring that internal policies and external practices such as customer support helps amplify a positive feeling in a culturally ethical manner. The stakes are high. Your job is to be an advocate for meaningful change within your organizations by taking what you heard today and putting it into action tomorrow. So I'm assigning you homework. This week, identify one of the emotional shortcuts that you could implement for your organization in 2020. Is it lexicon, audio, visuals, experience such as normative behavior, or jumping into culture ethically? And if you'd like to read more of the case studies on the companies and find these shortcuts, then you can follow me on LinkedIn or read the book, Follow the Feeling. And I hope these tips help you build a better brand, a stronger company, and cut through the noise of building strong communities that amplify and promote your brand.